Welcome to the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast. Whether you are a seasoned professional or a first-time fundraiser, we have the advice you need to take your next step toward major gift mastery. I'm your host, Tom Dauber, President of Abundant Vision Philanthropic Consulting. Last week's conversation was a blast. I'm so excited to have you with me for this next segment. Let's get back to the show. So the technology companies are very good at turning relationships into numbers and to mimic natural relationships with algorithms and things like that.
Yeah.
How do we talk about money and donors internally in our organizations with our own staff without advancing the idea that relationships are numbers? How do we protect our relationships from that?
Again, you're circling some of the answers. If you listen to some of the questions you're asking, you're circling back to some of the same, you're answering some of the same sort of predicaments that I think we have because we have so much embraced the logic of the marketplace. Walmart and Target and McDonald's, they all talk about consumers like as if we're the commodities, right? They buy our data and they sell us the, cheapest quality product that they can. And the machine just keeps running, right? And we all know what those machines do. There's a reason why companies like McDonald's and Walmart end up in the headlines for exploiting their employees and not manufacturing goods in the places in the world they shouldn't, and all the accusations that get thrown at companies like that. When you look at some of our largest, most sophisticated fundraising operations, those systems are not all that far off from the same, in many ways, the same sort of underlying systems. And eventually, I do think that they'll eventually catch up. And they will bring about, I don't know if that's answering your question, but I do think eventually some of this is going to pop.
I guess what I'm trying to get at, Jason, is so we've identified what we don't want to be. We don't want to be coercive like the state.
Yeah.
We don't want to be transactional. We don't want to be in sales market mode.
Yeah. Yeah.
We want to be into mutuality. We want to be into relationship. We want to be into trust. How as a major gift officer, how as an executive director, do I look at the work I'm doing and try to lean into that? What do I do? How do I look at the world differently?
I think a lot of fundraisers do look at the world that way. But like I said many times on my own podcast, I came to the conclusion, I don't think fundraising has a fundraiser problem. I think it has a supervisor problem.
Okay, excellent.
The more you utilize this logic of the state or the market, both of which tend to be very manipulative systems that learn how to basically manipulate and control and sort of anticipate. They kind of look at sort of people as things that they can sort of move around the way they want to, and they have their own ways of doing that. But a lot of that underlying assumption eventually translates into a lot of the unfortunate ways that fundraisers say that they're treated or the expectations that they have. And any experience that a fundraiser describes is essentially just the flip side of the same experience the donor is oftentimes experiencing.
Interesting.
What a fundraiser is experiencing, if a fundraiser experiences the unreasonableness of a board member or an executive director saying, hey, you need to generate all this money and do it in this short period of time and do it for this particular reason, et cetera, and who cares what it cost us? The donor just experiences that differently, but in much way the same.
Okay, so we've narrowed down a bit into supervision and how maybe a sales mentality or a state mentality, coercive mentality is driving folks. And I'll bet this is especially true at large, like universities, hospitals, things like that.
Yeah.
that corporate approach that you see. So let's say, again, I'm an executive director and I've got a team of people under me. How do I avoid that? Like, what can I do differently to protect against those other approaches creeping in?
I think where most organizations can experience a more gift-like economy is largely by increasing proximity. So it's relying on less sort of systems and more proximity. I think they can rely on conversation more and less less relying on third parties. We talked for a little while ago about third party data. I wrote a Substack 18 months ago about what was happening in Major League Baseball, where we were watching baseball players. There wasn't enough activity on the field. And so Major League Baseball has changed the rules of the game in order to get more field activity and focus less on home runs. So what's the relevance to your question? I think if we had fundraisers in closer proximity, in more conversation on the field, if you will, right? Having more direct interaction, relying less on other mediums of communication, relying less on mail and relying less on digital communication, but real conversation. I think they would discover that some of these extraordinary opportunities that await them are actually there. They'll reveal themselves without needing a third party to tell you that these folks are extraordinarily wealthy.
So does this boil down to get to know your donors, spend time with them and listen to them and try to build good relationships with them?
It does. It does. Yes, Thomas, it does. But the word relationships is kind of like that word transactional that I kept hearing on the podcast, right?
Okay. Yeah.
On the podcast, I kept hearing transactional. And that was one of those moments where the fundraisers are not. So Thomas, that statement wasn't me making it. That was 360 fundraisers. And they kept saying it's transactional. So I went looking for, okay, what does that word transactional mean? And what I started to find is exactly where we started this conversation, this idea of modes of exchange. There's actually, historically, throughout all of human history, there's essentially three types of transactions, right? And you answer your own question. What is that fundraiser saying to us when they say it's too transactional? What they're actually saying is it's too much like the market. It's too sales.
Exactly.
That's them. That's not you. That's not me. That's the fundraiser saying that. And my guess is that if the donor was doing the same conversations that I was doing with fundraisers, my guess is they would tell us something very similar, that it's too transactional. They would probably mean it's too much like the marketplace. It's too much like the relationship I have with Target. It's not distinct enough. No, it's not distinguishable enough. Yeah.
So when you look at the state of the profession as it sits today, clearly there's lots of questions about CRMs, data, how that's going to be utilized in the market that's out there. Can the body of donors that we have, can it sustain all the need and all the asking and all the things that, so one might look at the profession with some cynicism, and one might look at the future with some doubt.
I called it in my book, it's messy adolescence.
Yes.
I said fundraising's in its messy adolescence. Fundraising at its best is 100 years old. A lot of times people will reference, I think his last name was Ward. He was an early 20th century fundraiser with the YMCA, and they wrote about him in London. They wrote about him here in the U.S. Ward was his last name. And he's oftentimes referred to as the father of modern fundraising or something. So early 20th century. going back to the book that I was referencing earlier that talks about expertise and how experience evolves into expertise, one of the ways they start their book is the idea of the way we use bloodletting. The medical profession did bloodletting for like 3 or 4 centuries. Right. And eventually they realized that there was something wrong with bloodletting. Eventually they got to the point where the idea of putting leeches on us and letting them suck our blood wasn't a good sort of an idea. But that was 300 or 400 years before they figured that out.
I should stop then.
What's that?
I should stop.
What do you mean you should stop?
With the bloodletting, I should stop.
Yeah, you should definitely stop. Right? If you're working with a doctor right now who's still using that particular approach, but you can see the point really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
If fundraising has only given itself 100 years at best, then we can at least say we're just in our messy adolescence, which means we don't actually have to be terribly. Some people would say, if they were talking about the way that Jason describes the profession, some people would say that I'm overly critical. I'm actually more optimistic than I think some people are, because I'm just looking at us like my teenage son. I'm saying he's 19 years old. He hasn't figured everything out. He's a young adult. He knows how to drive. He gets himself to work. He knows how to keep his boss happy, et cetera, et cetera. But he does at times make mistakes in ways he will make foolish decisions. He's in his messy adolescence. He's on he's 19. And my younger daughter, we've got 4 kids. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If you look at a child or a young adult and you say they're in their messy adolescence, you're not sitting there saying that they're screwed up or doomed to, you're just saying, hey, they haven't figured everything out yet.
Yeah. So looking forward.
Yeah.
When you think about early career fundraisers, people that are just getting into the profession right now.
Yeah.
What do you hope most that they recover about the nature of generosity?
So when my book came out in 2018 and since then, and then with the podcast and periodically conversations like this, I've had events, I'll be at a speaking engagement and a young fundraiser will come up to me, or I'll be working with a client and I'll sort of be, answering this question that you're, what is it that I want for that younger, less, and you know what I tell them, Thomas, is I say, I want you in front of the donor. I want you negotiating that relationship. I want you kind of like what you and I are doing here. I want you making eye contact. I want you to see and understand even some of the consulting work that I've done over the years. I get out in the field with my clients and I do what's called base coaching. So I'm very close to the game. Mm-hmm. And I want the fundraiser to have the benefit of watching the way that someone experiences giving in a very meaningful, very close encounter. I want them to have a close encounter with the gift. And I think they can only really have that in some of what you and I would traditionally call major gifts type work. I don't want them to be terribly concerned, especially early in their career, about the size of those contributions. I would much prefer a young fundraiser go out and collect a $500 check from a board member and just navigate that than worry themselves about whether they're maximizing that potential, running well screening data and finding out. Just go and experience, get out in the field. And don't rely on these non-living machines to intermediate for us. And my guess is the more we do that, the more, to even some of the comments you've said, the more the work will align with that of the gift and not that of the commodity or the tax.
That's fantastic advice. So my last question for you, Jason.
And we've covered a lot of them, haven't we?
We sure have.
I hope you got listeners who really hold on this long.
I hope I have listeners too. We'll see next week. No, if I think about my audience, a lot of different types of people, but many of them are new to the fundraising profession. Maybe they've come from some other field because they've been passionate about the cause and they've moved into it for that reason.
Yeah.
If that's that person, they're sitting out there beyond what you've just said, early career people are, and maybe these aren't early career people. What's one piece of advice beyond getting in front of the donor, beyond working through that experience of the gift?
What would you say to them? How would you encourage them in their work?
Well, I didn't know where that question was going. I was sort of listening and thinking, okay, do I remember reading this question? So for some of those people who are mid-career and oftentimes transitioning from the marketplace, and I feel like I don't want to, because I know we're at the end of the conversation, I would caution them, I don't get on the bandwagon of fundraising is like sales, for example, because
Thankfully,
I think that betrays the point that I'm trying to make with the gift. And I think the flaw in that thinking is that fundamentally, sales relationship needs a commodity. It needs an object. That's what a commodity is about. The commodity is an object. There's two people, subjects, but their focus is really on the commodity that's being exchanged, the object. And in a gift relationship, the object doesn't really matter at all if it's even there. It's secondary to the relationships that the two subjects are trying to have. So how does this get back to that mid-career salesperson? Mid-career salespeople, for example, who are coming into fundraising, are in the business of selling objects.
that's right.
They've sold cars, they've sold widgets, they've sold objects. So where do they sometimes get in trouble? They get in trouble by basically finding things that are not really objects, like the cause itself or like the people that are being served. So they very easily could be accused of commodifying things that they shouldn't be commodifying, like the little kids at the school or the homeless folks or whatever. So I think that's, just be careful when being aware of sort of the context from which you come in order to sort of transition into a space that essentially plays by different rules.
Great.
I'm a big fan of, this hasn't come up, but I'm a really big fan of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Oz operated by different rules. It essentially was a different economy, unlike Kansas. That's essentially what Alice in Wonderland is, the same type of story. There's all sorts of stories in literature where the character goes to a different land that operates by different rules and different economies, and who you think's in charge really isn't. That's all we're really talking about here, is that most of us think that we're still in Kansas, but we're actually in Oz, or the other way around. There's different rules. The gift plays by different rules. And we're very accustomed to the rules that the marketplace gives us, or the state gives us. But the gift wants to play by different rules. And so we have to be a little bit like Dorothy or Alice or whoever, who finds themselves in this unfamiliar place and kind of figure those new rules out.
Fantastic. Well, Jason, you've been so generous with your time and your wisdom as well. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Yeah, this was fun.
Now, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast provider. I'm your host, Tom Dauber. Thank you for joining me as we journey together towards major gift mastery on the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast.